One of the great things about Discord is you can individually control the volumes of all of the people that you see. So if there's ever a time somebody's too loud or too quiet, you can mouse over their name display on the Discord and adjust the volume individually to make sure that you hear it like you want to hear it. Um, and we have on the Discord pane, you'll see there's a voice channel, which you're in right now for the camera, and there's also a text channel that I'll be monitoring if you have questions that you want to ask Greg as we have our conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Mid Chat on Discord with the Firefly Scientist. Our guest this time is Greg Pask. He is a biologist and a faculty member at Middlebury College. If you'd like to know more about him and his research, go over to the text in the chat channel. His bio from the Middlebury website is linked over there. I think it's safe to say, Greg, that you love bugs.
That is correct.
So
Big bug lover.
for me, bugs are sort of creepy. They have too many legs. They fly, they bite, they pinch, they get on. They're in the dark corners of your house. They're kind of a spooky thing. Why do you love them?
I think that, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why I love them. I think part of it is like the search and the game of trying to find them. Like, if you're into plants, you can walk outside, find plants. If you're looking for any insects that are outside the ones that you have in your home, you are trying, you have to kind of actively search for, or you just might happen upon it out in nature. So that kind of leads to a lot of like, questing for to find new species and things like that. Similar to what people do with birds, and it's a global phenomenon to kind of find new insects, and it's actually what Pokemon is originally based on. The joy of trying to find new insects. It was based on entomology at first, so I think that kind of sums up a lot of it for me.
Are you like, if a medical doctor goes to a party, someone's like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad to see you. I got a little stiff neck here. When you go somewhere, people are like, oh my gosh, I saw this crazy bug. It had yellow spots on it. What was it?
This happens all the time. I mean, oh man, when we get back to like in-person parties, but yeah, the I always will get comments about like, hey, I have this insect. Oftentimes, it's insects getting into their home, and one of the other species, groups of species I study is ants, and it's always like, I have these ants that come into my home. How can I deal with them? I used to work with mosquitoes, and it was, why do mosquitoes like me more than other people? And everybody says that. So yeah, it's a common question, but I try to use it as like, hey, this is a little avenue that I can get in and teach you something really cool about insects that you didn't know before.
That is awesome. And I'm assuming that you foster an environment where insects are fun and not scary.
Yes, yeah. So much of the fear of insects comes from society and pressures. I have two young children, and they have no fear of insects just because it's commonplace, and we shouldn't. It's not like this kind of night instinctual thing is like a fear of like a snake or something. Insects are just kind of another little invertebrate that we should just learn to appreciate and love.
So one of the reasons that you are, besides just we could talk about bugs all day, but there's a very specific thing to talk about. You and a group of collaborators were recently approved for a grant from the National Science Foundation for a 5-year project to study fireflies. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that project in a moment. But tell us a little bit about fireflies, what we may know about them, what we may not know. What's a basic firefly tutorial that you would like to give us?
Yeah, one thing that's, fireflies are really nice because they are a very charismatic insect species. People who might have, the creepy crawly, fear of insects, they appreciate fireflies. They have spent summers, catching them in bottles, hopefully letting them go rather quickly because they have a lot of business to do. But yeah, these very, charismatic, beautiful flash patterns that can come out, and sometimes they vary so much. And all of that flash communication is just this really complicated language of love that they're trying to find a mate. When we think about insects in general, we can think back to, and again, I'm showing that I have young children, like the very hungry caterpillar, right? In that juvenile state, it's all about eating and growing and getting bigger. The second half of the very hungry caterpillar, that the second book that doesn't get made, is where it's all about finding mating success. And that's what these adult fireflies that we see are trying to do. Fireflies live about like 1 to 2 years underground as larvae. As they develop and grow and eat and get bigger, they eat like snails and earthworms, things like that. And then when they get to that adult stage, it's all about trying to find that mate, and they might have only a month to do so. And that's where this flash pattern communication comes into play, where you have males flying around trying to signal to females who are kind of more secluded in like the grasses or short plants. And then if they get together, mating success happens, and we have some new fireflies for the next couple of years.
2 years underground. Like now, outside here in Vermont, it's cold. It's below freezing. There's snow on the ground. They're safe under there. Do they have little burrows that they live in? How do they live under there for 2 years?
So insects and a couple other invertebrates will go. It's like a hibernation equivalent. They go under like this overwintering state. It's called diapause, where they will kind of shut down their metabolism to a point where they can still survive, but they're not expending a bunch of energy, and they can make it. And underground, you got a little bit more, protection from the changing climates, and it gets a little, slightly, warmer, the deeper you go. So yeah, that's their big strategy. But there's some adults that try to, they can make it in the winter out, above the ground, which is also really interesting.
So as we go on, you can ask questions either in the chat here on Discord that I'm monitoring in the mid-chat text channel, or if you're streaming on Twitch, I'm also watching that text channel as well. If you've got some questions over there, we've multitasking where we're getting input for questions for Greg. So, Greg, your 5-year project, you have found that there are some fireflies that have evolved to not use this flashing communication for this very important process of mating. And the little bit I know about evolution is that if it's not beneficial for a species, they stop doing it. So you're going to try to find out why these fireflies use pheromones to attract their mate versus flashing. Is that an accurate description of your project?
Yeah, that's very accurate. Yeah, there's they're still considered fireflies technically speaking, because as larvae they will have this glowing, light, this nice little glowing light reaction that takes place in their abdomen. But yeah, this really interesting evolutionary story where
Interesting.
insects that don't sorry insects, like most insects, use chemical communication to find their mates as adults. But the group of fireflies said, "Hey, we're going to use this, light flash at night pattern." But then within that, some groups of firefly species decided, "All right, we're not going to do this," and they're kind of reverting back to the original communication method. And we're trying to figure out, are they reverting back to the same method and the same genes that enable that process to occur, or are they completely coming up with brand new ways to make a pheromone that can attract a male, and have the male have different receptors, smell receptor genes that enable them to pick up that specific pheromone and find that mating success, find that female.
There was a question in chat. What are the trend of firefly populations here around Middlebury and in Vermont? Are they shrinking, or when I look out in my backyard and I see my backyard full of light, is it very healthy? Like, are you concerned about fireflies in Vermont?
So this is my first year in Vermont. We arrived last July. In terms of Vermont and Middlebury, it seems like fireflies are doing quite well. I was able to kind of find a lot of the study species we're interested in just outside my door, flying by me, and then it's like, all hell breaks loose. I'm like, oh, we had to go get a vial. I gotta, collect this. Is it a female? Is it a male? Things like that. But kind of globally, and especially in the U.S., especially around with a lot of light pollution that's occurring these days, firefly populations are dwindling. Even if you kind of live on a road where, people will drive by with headlights at night while you're watching fireflies, you'll see the effect of lights and kind of, man-made light on firefly success. You'll see them all signaling, and then all of a sudden the big, you know an SUV drives by with headlights flashing, blinding everything, and you'll see the fireflies. There'll be no flashing for about like 10 to 15 seconds, and then they'll eventually start to flash again. And you can imagine, if that's a floodlight on the side of your house, or a street light that's very bright, you're limiting these potential mating success spaces that fireflies can inhabit. Especially if you think about them being underground for 1 to 2 years, that may have been a great place when, their mom laid them as eggs into the ground, but now all of a sudden they come out and there's a big light. and now they can't just emerge and have, they have to now find a nice mating site. So yeah, I think in Vermont though they're pretty good, at least from what I've seen.
And at this, the thing that you just said that I'm curious about is you love these animals, but you also have to capture them to study them. How do you balance that love with your scientific interest?
That's a really good question, and and everybody I talk to kind of rationalizes it a different way. Other people who are like doing insect work on like pest species, they have no problem just swarming, gathering these things up and taking care of it because it's also a good control mechanism. But for fireflies, we're going to help maintain that population. So things that we try to make sure we're not oversampling in certain areas. That once we find areas that are good, we're not oversampling and getting too many of these fireflies. That when we do sample, that we're using everything. So we're gonna kind of grind up the abdomen if we need to kind of extract some pheromones. But we're also going to use the rest of the animal to get genomic sequences from there. So we're kind of making sure that we're using them as efficiently as we can. And if we're doing behavioral studies, seeing how they behave in some certain mating behavior, we'll do all that first, and then harvest later. Because again, these certain populations, one, they can be hard to find, the chemical communicating ones with the pheromones, and we just kind of make sure that we use them enough, and to know that a lot of our work can be also then used towards conservation strategies in the long term. So, can we use these chemical pheromones to actually lure them in to monitor and survey the area and see are populations getting affected or not?
A big part of the student life and the educational experience for students at Middlebury College is experiential learning, and working with researchers like yourself on these long-term projects that'll be collaborating with several other colleges and universities is a great opportunity. How do you do that for the students? Are the students clamoring to join this project, or do they even know about it yet?
Students are clamoring to join our lab group. Unfortunately, space restrictions are low. We have COVID restrictions space wise, but also just how many students we can have in the lab at one time. So the students who got in early, they're enjoying it now. I have two students who are wrapping up their winter term experiences right now, and they're learning all the ropes. And the Firefly project will be starting up this month in March, and we'll start to kind of start that process of cloning out, do all sorts of things. They're learning genetics. And so what we do is we actually will take firefly genes, smell receptor genes out of the firefly, put them to make transgenic fruit flies that express firefly olfactory receptor genes in their antenna. And then, so we're making these flies smell they have the smelling capabilities of a firefly. And then they will go in and learn to do electrophysiology, which is taking an electrode, poking a little hair on the antenna of the fruit fly, and then puff different pheromones on to see if we get active neuronal responses inside. So we're actually like measuring the smell potential, because you can't just ask a fly or a firefly what it's smelling. You have to go in there with a little electrode and see the neuronal activity. So yeah, it's nice. We're getting the students involved in every phase of this project, and it was written with them in mind. And the collaborations that we have with Bucknell University and the University of California Riverside, they'll be actually able to interact with these groups. Now that we know so much of this digital communication platform, it's kind of boilerplate for everybody now. So it'll really lead to a nice, rich experience. But in the future, we're going to have groups that go down to Pennsylvania, groups that come up to Vermont, both groups going down to the Smokies to do some collections down there. So just bridging interested insect researchers at different universities together, different colleges.
Do you prefer lab work or field work?
I have done mostly casual field work, which is just me kind of going out. I'm more of a lab work guy. I really like kind of building my own lab equipment. We're kind of setting up these electrophysiology rigs now, and a lot of what we do can be like pipetting, transferring small clear volumes of liquids around. There's really important DNA in there, but you can't really see it immediately. So the things that I like about the that can be hard in lab work are really nice in field work, because you can immediately see what you're finding, and even so it's like immediate gratification. But if you have to go and look at a microscope, it's slightly delayed, but it's still there pretty immediately. So I'm a budding field biologist, but mostly lab trained.
Is there a balance when you're working with your students who like, I just want to get out in the field, I want to go out, and then you're like, this is really actually very important work that we're doing right here in this room. How do you foster that excitement for being in the lab for someone who might want to be out in the field?
That's a great thing, a great point. I think it's something you really have to manage when you recruit students and talk to them about what it means. Like if we have tons of people already out in the field, too many people out in the field can be, an issue. Same thing with too many people in the lab. I really want to try to make sure that I'm maximizing their interest. Um, and say if I put a student out in the field that really wanted to be in the lab or vice versa, their interest is their best motivation at this point, and trying to capitalize on that. So we'll see when it comes up. Oftentimes the students that I get, they're longing to go out in the field, but they also appreciate these cool little things that we do in the lab that is pretty tricky, and it's amazing results when they see that results return on these projects. So we'll see how I handle that going forward as I delve more into the field.
Can you talk a little bit about the collaborative nature of research in general and your project in particular? How will you be sharing the duties with other investigators on the team? How you'll be sharing that with students at Middlebury or from other places as well?
Yeah, so some of the collaboration is already taking place. We're already having like weekly meetings with all the principal investigators of the different institutions and getting our students involved in that. We're thinking of doing like a weekly journal club where we discuss relevant papers in this field that are going to weigh in on different aspects of this project. Part of it is also we don't do a lot of the like the evolutionary genomics that's involved in this process, but a collaborator at Bucknell is really doing a lot of that work. So they're feeding us these gene sequences that seem to be of interest, and then we can go through and kind of do the functional tests and say, hey, these genes, what do they actually do in the firefly? So it's kind of, but then that work that we do, really informs future work in the genomics field. So much of biological research, and I think scientific research in general, is getting very interdisciplinary. So expecting me to be able to do every part of a complicated, complex project is not really feasible. Also, I don't have the time or financial support for that. But we can do what we do really well and trying to see other people who would like us to kind of be involved in these skills. It's actually how this whole project started. I was doing this work in ant olfaction and ant smell genes, and somebody's like, hey, there's this really cool firefly project, and that piqued my interest. I got some that I used to work with and ants involved out in University of California Riverside, and kind of really good open communication where sometimes science can get competitive and you're trying to do certain science and find certain results beforehand. It kind of gets away from the beauty of science and finding out new things in the world and opening it up to the people who might be able to take that set, the results that you find, take it further because of their specific skill set. um, so we're really excited to have all of us work together and also have students from other institutions start to train each other and collaborate on this process.
That sounds like it must be an amazing and very rewarding part of being a teacher and a faculty member is seeing the students understand how science works and they've been curious about this and then making those connections. How is that personally rewarding for you? Is that what keeps driving you as a scientist and an educator?
Yeah, it's some so much of like it really breaks my heart when I hear people say, "Oh, you're a scientist." Like, I didn't really like science and in school, and it breaks my heart because science is welcoming to a lot of people. But science isn't taking a 50-minute timed exam, you know, every couple weeks. That's not realistic science. That's not how science is done. So being able to kind of bring students in, I think some of the most impactful teaching I can do is giving them these experiential research experiences, like giving these hands-on experiences where they are seeing how science works and they're seeing all the processes that go into making textbook figures. And all that in diving in and saying, yeah, I kind of wanted to try out research, and all of a sudden they come out and they're like, I think I want to go to grad school and become a scientific researcher. Those are some of the really great experiences that I've had, and it's incredibly rewarding. It's why I got into this and why I wanted to do this at a small liberal arts school where I am more involved as opposed to kind of sitting in my office writing grants and mentoring the upper levels. Like, no, I'm working side by side with undergraduate students, sometimes on the same project, sometimes I'm doing my own project, and they have full independence to run with it.
Let's talk about fireflies specifically. Have you learned a lot about fireflies just writing up this proposal and up to this point? Like, what's the most surprising thing that you found out about fireflies in general?
Yeah, fireflies continue to be so interesting to me. I get so much of my firefly knowledge from Dr. Sarah Lauer at Bucknell, who we were used to be colleagues, and she so many of them, I really in-depth questions I would ask. I'm like, oh, how are they doing this? And she's like, it's not known. And like the unknowns in fireflies are what's really, really driving a lot of this project forward. Or like we know this in some of the classic insect model systems, but fireflies are a completely different group. And not beetles haven't been looked at as much as like the fruit fly, which is your classic insect model, or some of these other models. Even ants. There's so much that we know about ants compared to what we know about fireflies. It's really uneven. So yeah, and so one of the really interesting things I got to experience firsthand are these synchronous fireflies that are found in a couple locations in the US, where all the males will kind of and the females will they'll time up their flashes. There'll be like 6 flashes in a row and then quiet for a little bit and then flash, and they all flash at the same time. And there's festivals that have surrounded this amazing event that occurs, and it's just amazing if you think about all the things that are happening where they're having to pick up this flash signal and time up their own. You can imagine like humans trying to sync up occasions and fully get in sync. It's something that musicians have to do all the time. And here fireflies are doing this, except the stakes are really high because it's between mating success or not.
I think we talked briefly before this about you learned a little firefly language. Talk a little about how you sort of have come to understand what the firefly is saying with their flashing.
Oh, so which I'm trying to remember what you're
I think
referring to here.
you described you knew when a firefly was upset and didn't want to be held
Oh, yes.
anymore.
Yes, certain fireflies, you'll have the normal flash pattern, but if you handle them roughly, they will start to kind of do an angry flash in your hand where it's just like a bunch of kind of rapid flashes. And that's a good sign. I mean, from a biological standpoint, the flashing is signaling that you shouldn't eat that insect. And a lot of predators maybe have tried it before and then they spit it out. There's actually these toxins that fireflies produce. So the angry flash should be jarring enough to say this is not something that I should handle. They also will like do this thing called reflexive bleeding, where they'll take some of their blood, the hemolymph that's floating inside them, and push it out, and that's where this toxin occurs. So you've probably also seen it with ladybug handling. Like if you handle ladybugs that come into your house, that little like kind of orangey yellow substance that comes out of them, that is reflexive bleeding. That's their blood, and it always smells like grassy and tastes bitter to predators that would want to eat it. Fireflies have it, but it's even stronger.
A couple questions in chat. What would be the one unknown about fireflies that you want to figure out?
The one unknown that I mean, we really want to figure out, it's the basis of this grant, is like what pheromones are they communicating with? Are they similar across the board, or did they have to remake the whole pheromone system when they got rid of their adult light system? Adult light communication. Um, is it something that's a big thing? If you just kind of decide, just like you said before, evolutionary changes, if they're not beneficial, they go away. So they had to have overhaul of their communication system surrounding their mating success. So if it didn't work, they didn't mate, and the genes that allowed that weren't passed on. So we're trying to figure out like how did they pull this off, and can we look at the pheromone, the receptor for that pheromone, and see if we can kind of tell this evolutionary story of how different firefly branches have accomplished this feat.
And we talked a little bit again in our little pre-conversation, mentioned that this is sort of where this research will outgrow and become more, is to learn more about insect communication in general, maybe animal communication in general. Is that what you're sort of
Mhm.
hoping this will lead to?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the downstream effects, and I think that's why we had this written into our NSF proposal. I think that's why they really liked it. It kind of sets up, all right, what are the costs and benefits of completely overhauling your mating system. And this is goes beyond just fireflies. It can extend into all sorts of insects. And for some beneficial insects, we want to make sure that we're not messing up this system. For pest insects or invasive species that shouldn't be, where like kind of biological control and making sure that population doesn't grow is a real priority. Can we use this to say, all right, if we try to stop their normal communication strategy, like jam the communication, how likely is it that they're going to evolve and do something brand new? And what does that look like? And can we be prepared for step 2, step 3? And this also goes to all sorts of, all animals and sorts of communication. And, this is, getting two, conspecifics together, making sure that they have mating success is the most important part of an animal's life.
So that sounds well. We have just a couple minutes left, but the thing that you said makes me feel like how can we do pheromone cancel culture? What can we bring in to make sure that these insects cannot talk to each other, deplatform them in pheromones? Another question in chat is, and maybe I'll ask it in this way: are fireflies so mysterious and lovely that we don't want to know more about them? Why have scientists studied fireflies less than other insects?
I think part of it is that unfortunately conservation of kind of insects in general, if they don't have an immediate human health related goal or an agricultural goal, has been put on the back burner. So like if we were studying mosquitoes and how to jam, this is people get funded in all sorts of huge global, all across the globe. People are looking at mosquito communication. Same thing with especially with like Zika, dengue, West Nile, malaria is the biggest one that people are looking at. So, part of science is how much have people thrown money at it. And the nice thing is that we have, support looking at basic science. And people, I like to use, kind of more foundational science because people think basic science, why don't you do advanced science? But basic science is like basic research is like, all right, understanding the fundamentals, the building blocks that then we can extrapolate to more applied context. And if you just jump to the applied, you can be missing a lot of things that'll expedite the process when you start to think of different applications, whether it is human health or agricultural. But I don't know. I mean, I think part of the scientific mindset is that if you see something that is amazing and you don't know how it works, you really want to know. And I think I am victim to that as well.
Are there firefly myths or legends of fireflies, like where they came from? And I haven't read any of those, but I don't know if you've come across any in your research. Like,
In terms of kind of mythology, I'm not. I mean, there's a lot of they're always included in a lot of stories. One of the things that we talked about before is we have a collaboration that's on this grant, and we'll be bringing this individual to Middlebury. Ibiyanka Alao, who is the ambassador of the arts for the U.S. from Nigeria, and he has this whole story. A lot of his art is about fireflies and kind of the mythology that he would get from his own father, talking about these are like the stars that the stars that kind of come down and all sorts of cool storytelling that's involved. And he will be coming to Middlebury to talk about this. We're hoping to get him as an artist in residence in certain places and do a lot of outreach programming where we're kind of combining science and the arts in the community.
that's a great way to end mid chat on Discord with a firefly scientist, is to sort of stress that the science is the beginning. It can bring all sorts of people together to learn new things, to develop a love and a passion for an area that you may not have even known existed before, and then can really inform the community as a whole, outside a college classroom, into K-12 education, into regular people who see the fireflies in their backyard and they want to know more about it. And Middlebury can really bring those things to the community. I think that's really something to be admired. And it seems like it's something that you're passionate about as well.
Yeah, it's the more we know about and what the science is. If we know all this stuff about science, we don't communicate it effectively. That knowledge gets lost, and we can bring more people in with citizen science. And I think that's outreach is on the responsibility of the scientists now to be effective communicators and show people how cool this is and how accessible it can be.
Well, I know you're really active on Twitter, so if people find a bug in their backyard they want to ask you about, Just find Greg Pask on Twitter and send you the picture and the question. Thank you so much for taking some time to join me and our guests here on Mid Chat on Discord with a Firefly scientist. And I hope we'll be able to check in with you after the summer and we'll see what you've learned.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm going to end the Twitch stream and then we'll hang out on Discord for another second.